I'm KARIMA Brown. It's Sunday and it's time for The Fix. First up, we dig deep into the political and economic challenges facing South Africa as we enter the new decade. Then we look at the state of the state and other social partners to deliver basic goods and services in a country where unemployment stands at over 10 million and violence has become endemic for communities trapped in inequality, poverty and unemployment. And as is custom, we take a look at what's made news headlines in the weekend newspapers and why. The Fix starts now. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold the decision makers to account. We tell you what matters and how it affects you and why you should care. Now, the political and economic landscape in South Africa for the 2020s is likely to be dominated by key events. Among them include the African National Congress's National General Council and the official opposition's Democratic Alliance's National Federal Council, where the party will elect a new leader. It also will test the economic growth strategies of the government to deal with a sluggish economy. To unpack these issues, I'm joined by my first expert panel. Welcome to the 2020s, author and analyst Eusebius McKaiser, and of course economist Neva Makgetla. Thank you so much for joining me on the first edition of the 2020s of The Fix.
It's a pleasure. Thanks,
let me get straight to it. Eusebius, tomorrow the African National Congress sits, as it always does every year, to prepare for the January 8th statement. The gathering happens in Kimberley. I was reading Mondle Makanya's column this morning, and he said we need to take the rose-coloured, rose-tinted glasses off. And more importantly, he says January 8th has become less and less important because the ANC has lost much of its shine. Do you agree with him?
I agree. I don't think we should overstate the significance of the January the 8th celebrations. The ANC obviously takes it as an important marker administratively to set the tone for party activity for the year. Also, as you know, how the party's internal conversations will feed into what happens within the state. So if you are a keen political observer, the January the 8th statement is important and the celebrations. But the bottom line, Karima, is if we project into the 2020s, that the ANC should focus on building a technocracy that works, which is why particularly the conversation you're going to have with the second panel of experts is so important. Grand statements and grand narratives about the country is something that South Africans are fatigued by, and what I'm going to be looking forward to over the next week or two, and as we march towards the State of the Nation address, is whether the ANC can firmly get into the minutiae of how to build a state that actually functions.
Neva, talking about a state that actually functions, we've just been plunged into load shedding again. Of course, it's not a surprise. The problems at Eskom are complex, they are many, and they go, deep. We've just heard the Eskom spokesperson in our former program say that the period of stage 2 load shedding has now been extended to Monday. Is that what that NEC meeting should be focusing on, and that January 8th statement? Talking to South Africans in very frank terms about what challenges faces an institution like Eskom that is so critical.
I think Eskom is the biggest and most urgent problem on the agenda for everybody, and I do think it's part of the problem is we've tended to focus on the state capture and on the restructuring, but the problem is actually the generation side. And that when you're in government, you don't always have the technical capacity to tell the engineers this is what you're getting wrong. So part of what I think would really help would be to get an outside review, because for 10 years we've been saying you need to fix, you need to improve the repair situation, you need to have a repair plan that works, and you need to make Medupi also pull it onto track. And we don't really, I think, outside of Eskom, nobody really understands what's going wrong. And it's very hard when you get into a room with a bunch of engineers and they're saying, this is the truth. And if we get it wrong, it could be even worse. It's very hard to challenge that. And I think people underestimate how hard it is. But the one thing I would also say is, 3 things, in fact, if that's okay. Economist. Yeah, that's very quick. I mean, the one thing is, firstly, that we need to be careful of trying to do quick fixes there and then everything else. That the state capture thing made a lot of people, I think, expect that there would be quicker fixes.
Yes.
But if we rush into solutions we don't get right, it can be worse. You know, so I think we have to be careful about that. I think that with Eskom, there is a solution, which is to bring in more private generation, but we have to be aware there are very big costs associated with that for the state, because as Eskom loses market share, and this is what in many ways they're just resisting, as they lose market share, you end up writing off assets, and we put a lot of money into those assets over time as a society. And there are also costs in terms of jobs that we would have to manage as well. And in that context, I do think it's linked to the whole issue of climate change.
Yes.
That the drought in Zimbabwe, I think, as well as the drought in the Northern Cape, points to the fact that climate change is accelerated, it's hitting faster than we thought. But South Africa has always been based on the coal value chain.
Yes.
And in some ways, you know, when people talk about the minerals energy complex, they're talking about coal.
Exactly.
And we need some way of dealing with that.
Eusebius, just segueing nicely into that, Gwede Mantashe is a very critical person in the African National Congress. He's the chairperson, but he's also the Minister of Energy. And what people often don't forget is that he is responsible, in as much as Pravin Gordhan is, for what kind of energy we decide on. His attachment to coal, is it healthy? Is it sustainable over the long run? Or is he just servicing a constituency which he thinks he has, which is mine workers?
It's not healthy, and there's a lot of opacity around his interest in terms of his addiction to coal, Karima. We know from the energy experts, particularly the independent ones, that we need an energy mix that will allow us to be less reliant on coal. That makes economic sense. It also makes environmental sense. What doesn't make political sense is why on earth the minister who'd be so short-sighted in terms of not putting the interests of the country ahead of whatever his private interests are that we're not aware of. One of the stories I'm looking forward to having greater transparency on when it comes to us in the media is to make sense of what the hell is going on inside the head of the minister in terms of this contradiction between being told time and again by a range of disinterested experts that we need a greater mix in terms of energy security and energy sources, and his disinterest in that conversation. It doesn't make sense at all.
Absolutely. Neva, you were pointing up your hand whilst Eusebius was speaking. Your point?
No, just to say, I think this is where the issue of, which is actually in the white paper on climate change, that we need to also say, what do we do about those communities and workers and businesses that are affected by downsizing in coal, rather than trying to slow it down? And I do think, so there's two issues there, and one of the issues is that it is a 10 to 15-year transition no matter what. So part of the problem is Eskom is being pushed out because of their own inefficiency, because they can't compete with private producers. Yeah, I mean, they're near monopoly, but their generation has gone down 10%, and that has affected coal output, and so has the decline in demand overseas. This change will happen. But if you have 10 or 15 years, you can actually manage it in a way that gives people alternatives. But the second point is, part of the problem is we always do these things in terms of saying, this will just happen to you, and you are disempowered. We need to find ways to come up with solutions as government, but also as parties, that empower people rather than just saying, we will deliver it to you on a platter. And then people reject it and we have no alternative.
Absolutely. Eusebius, you wrote a piece for the Mail and Guardian, just in terms of, you know, having practical solutions and not being trapped in ideological speak, if you like. And we all know that solutions aren't valueless, but the point that you were making in your piece was that we need to ask each political party practically, how are you going to grow the economy? How many jobs are you going to create? How are you going to deal with gender-based violence? Talk to me about why it's so important to get out of these, you know, loaded ideological debates and actually get to practicalities. And can one separate practical solutions from ideology?
I know the magic number is 3, but I'm going to give you 2 reasons, Karima, and 2 reasons only. The first is that I love ideological debates myself as a philosophy student, but there's a dishonesty when we become, I think, too obsessed with ideological debate. The dishonesty is that we don't want to speak plainly. So someone doesn't want to come out as being clearly against the welfare state, social security, the amount we spend on this or that or the other. So part of my disdain for excessive theorizing is that theoretical debates obscure people's very plain and heartfelt convictions about what we should and shouldn't do practically.
Yeah.
The second reason is that people can't eat political theory. If someone is watching the show in Alex, they want to know what will this government do for them, or the DA as an alternative government, or the EFF, to increase their chances of social mobility.
Exactly.
That is a question that is a deeply practical question, and to reduce that question to some arcane debate about what John Stuart Mill had to say 200-300 years ago, I think is to be completely disingenuous. And so I think what I'd like to see, certainly a challenge for myself as a journalist this year, is to segue into public discourse that centers these immediate material concerns of people in how we do our journalism and the kinds of questions we ask of the newsmakers, as opposed to falling back on the old debates to privatize, to not to privatize. Are you a liberal? Are you a libertarian? Are you a Marxist? That's interesting for the university hallways, but I think in the public realm, the most urgent questions right now, and there I agree with Neva, are such questions as, how will you fix Eskom? What will you do about unemployment? What are you going to do about poverty? Those questions need to take center stage this year and for the next couple of years.
Absolutely. Now, talking about taking center stage in terms of practical options, there's been a lot of discussion around what is practicably doable. But Neva, as you know, someone who's got a history in trade unionism, they are social partners. Not everyone can get what they want. What is the biggest trade-off that you think needs to be made, both at the ground level and at national level, so that people can put themselves in each other's shoes, so that we can lose our sectional interests and act in the national interest, and trust that the state will actually drive national interests instead of private financial interests, as some often accuse them of, and is often borne out by fact?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest trade-off is this, that to be a sustainable society and the kind of democracy we want, we need to have a more equitable society, and that means people at the top have to accept some restraints. What we've never managed to figure out is how much restraint can we actually ask of people before they just basically pack up and leave. And part of that is we need to say, we have these big businesses, we need them, and they have power, but we need them also to change. And how do we figure out how much pressure we can put on them, how much kinds of costs we can put on them to get the change we need? And I just want to flag something. The international environment is so negative. Like, we always blame ourselves for the slowdown.
Yes.
But in fact, every other developing country has seen a massive slowdown in growth.
Yeah.
And particularly the ones that are based on mining, because of the end of the commodity boom. Prices bottomed out in 2015. Big surprise since then. We've all of us seen slower growth and political pressure and political disintegration in places like Brazil and Russia. It's also very bad. So to me, the issue becomes, given those constraints, how do we work to empower people at the bottom? How do we work to ensure that the people at the top are prepared to help achieve a national solution? And by the way, what just happened in the Middle East is going to make it much, much harder in 2020.
You were actually reading my mind. I was going to say, Eusebius, we often tell government, stop blaming global conditions for your own inaction. But what is happening in Iran, and the fact that the US actually assassinated a senior, probably the second most senior official in the Iranian state, in another country, which the UN rapporteur has already suggested is an illegal act. How do you think that is going to impact on those very practical decisions that we need to make? I mean, we were promised, for example, a petrol downgrade. Instead, we are facing a petrol increase as a result of what has happened.
Well, the reality is, KARIMA, that we plug into that global system, and one of the consequences of that for each one of us as active and engaged South African citizens, us in the media, the commentariat, and for the government, is to also situate our analyses about South African challenges globally. And so how will we be impacted? Well, obviously there's going to be an economic impact as a result of what is happening in Iran. The aggressive move on the part of Donald Trump is something we can't be neutral about, and I'm glad that Minister Naledi Pandor has already to that extent asked for caution on the international stage in terms of how that is playing out. And I think it's going to be critically important that as we analyze a lot of the solution space to the problems we've been listing in the last 10-15 minutes, that we are cognizant of the fact that some of those externalities in economics speak are externalities that will impact some of the choices that are available to us in terms of which ones are feasible, which ones are not feasible. So we have to be less parochial as South Africans as we analyze what to do about our own immediate problems.
Absolutely. Neva, let me ask you, I mean, the African National Congress has been in power for the last, 25, 26 years. We're going into a a municipal election in 2021. If you look at the other political parties, a lot of them have put economic alternatives on the table. The DA, for example, although we haven't had that policy conference yet, the EFF has a very pronounced understanding. I mean, they place all their faith in the state. When you look at political parties, what about them attracts you? What is interesting, even if you perhaps don't agree with everything they say, but what in the different political parties catches your eye that will deal with underlying issues, whether it's education, whether it's the use of water, etc.?
I mean, I think that's a difficult question because I can say what attracts me, but there are many things that repel me, just to be clear. And I do think what's interesting is all of us actually agree on the core strategies. It's what you were saying. It's how they get implemented and how rigorously we implement them and how many toes are we prepared to step on to implement something like better and more equitable education. Because inequality in education is still one of the main factors in the medium term that reproduces inequality. That in the historically African schools, you still have twice as many learners per teacher as in the historically white schools. Tells you possibly all you need to know about what's wrong with education.
Now, if you come to that question where race is such a driver of inequality, the Democratic Alliance is struggling with how to balance this question. You have Helen Zille, who has a very particular understanding of where she thinks the DA should go. You've got John Steenhuisen, who is the interim leader, the forerunner for who is most likely to get that post when the DA goes to its federal council. Will what the DA says and will what happens in the DA matter much, Eusebius?
No, and the reasons are several. The most important one is a poverty of ideas about what to do. The answer to the question you've just posed, Neva, about different political parties. The ANC has got a weird advantage of, as you've said often on your show, being gifted by weak opposition. I predict with my crystal ball in my pocket that will continue this year and for the next year or two, and that's a gift the ANC will take into the election cycle for the local elections. So there's nothing in the conversation happening inside the DA that wrestles with the question, how do we reduce inequality, how do we deal with apartheid spatial planning, how do we make sure that Cape Town is a better exemplar of what a DA government can do if it had to run every single municipality around the country. So I don't think that what the DA is offering the country is a set of alternative ideas to the ANC. Your question about identitarian politics inside the DA is one that's interesting to me as someone who writes on identity. But actually I think that's a secondary problem. I think the most fundamental problem for the DA is that it lacks an intellectual class of politicians, which the ANC does have, whatever you think of its fault lines and its weaknesses in terms of corruption and ethical leadership lacking at the moment. The DA simply doesn't have any core ideas for the most fundamental questions facing this country.
Neva, do you agree with Eusebius? And if that is the case, many people say the EFF is in fact the alternative, but we've seen very, very negative tendencies from the EFF, particularly its anti-democratic behavior toward the media, its closed operations inside the party. It's very opaque, it's very difficult to actually understand because there's such secrecy, but also its paucity of ideas. I mean, it already said that it's going to discipline people on the universities, for example. The matric result is coming out on the 8th, so there's obviously going to be that big flux. Is the answer to make the universities ungovernable, or is it actually to get as many people into universities and in ways that continues education rather than disrupt it?
You know, I think both left and right populism, and I actually think they're tending more to the right now, that are characterized by magical thinking, where they say, this one thing will solve everything. And I've always said here in South Africa, we're prone to that because under apartheid, it was always, we will get rid of apartheid, that will solve everything. Because we all actually agreed about what a democracy looks like, but we don't agree what the economy should look like. So you get these things like, we will make the universities ungovernable, we will redistribute the land. You know, some of those may be good ideas in themselves, but the fact is there's no sense of how does that get us to where we want to be, and that for me is the magical thinking.
Absolutely. And, I think it's that practicality that you wrote about, Eusebius. I'm going to give you the last word. 30 seconds.
Just on the EFF, I mean, if the DA lacks ideas, the problem with the EFF in turn, Karima, which they really need to take care to guard against is that they abuse the advantage of not being in government by refusing to answer questions of feasibility when they sloganeer about what we should do.
Absolutely. Guys, thank you so very much. Still ahead, the policy choices and the ability to deliver on them practically to change the lives of citizens for the better is what is coming on the other side of this.